Flying an airliner is a complex task. It requires highly trained pilots working together to get hundreds of tons of metal and people safely into the air. The margin for error is small, and when mistakes do happen, they can be catastrophic. When things go well, this complexity looks like clockwork, each of the components interlinking seamlessly and taking away the flight. The story of Korean Air Flight 8509 is a dark and complex one. Its cogs and wheels are psychological, technological, and even cultural. When the clockwork of this flight burst open just seconds after takeoff on December 22, 1999, it revealed deep-rooted problems in the aviation industry, problems which would need to be reckoned with fast. This is the story of Korean Air Flight 8509. It was 20 minutes past 7 in the morning at Stansted Airport, just northeast of London. As the airport slowly awakened to the day, 5,000 kilometers away in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, a Korean Air cargo Boeing 747 was preparing for departure. On board were 2 pilots, a flight engineer, and 33 tons of cargo. The 19-year-old aircraft had just arrived in from Seoul in South Korea and would now be completing the final leg of its journey to the UK. It had received a clean bill of health at Tashkent, and the flight was expected to go off without a hitch. But we wouldn't be starting the story here if that's what ended up happening. Mere seconds after takeoff, things would start to go wrong on this flight. These small imperfections in the clockwork would set in motion a chain of events which would ultimately doom the aircraft and its crew. At 29 minutes past 12 local time, the captain lined the massive aircraft up on runway 08 left at Tashkent. The plan was to depart to the east into the wind, and then, shortly after takeoff, to do a 180-degree turn to head out west towards Europe. The captain pushed the throttles to take off thrust, and the heavy plane began accelerating. Within moments, the aircraft took to the sky. As the captain climbed, he used this instrument here to ensure that he was putting the aircraft in the correct position. This instrument is known as the ADI, or Attitude Direction Indicator. As the name suggests, it tells the pilots their attitude, that is, their orientation with respect to the horizon, how much they are pointing up or down. This symbol here represents the plane, its nose here and its wings here, while in the background blue represents the sky and brown represents the earth. Right now, as the aircraft climbed, its wings were level and its nose was about 15 degrees above the horizon. If the plane was turning to the right, it would look like this. To the left would look like this. 10 degrees nose up looks like this, and 5 degrees nose down looks like this. At night or in clouds, pilots can't see anything out their windows, and they rely entirely on this instrument to tell the orientation of their aircraft. For this reason, the ADI is extremely important, so there are 3 of them in the cockpit, one for the captain, one for the first officer, and one backup. Each of them operates entirely independently, so that a failure in one has no effect on the others. Shortly after takeoff, as the plane passed 1,000 feet, the captain began a gentle turn to the right. But as he turned, something strange happened. As the aircraft rolled past 15 degrees of bank, the captain's ADI froze. He was still holding his control column to the right, and he could see out the window that his plane was clearly still banking further. But his instrument had apparently stopped registering the bank. He checked the standby ADI and the first officer's ADI, and both of these were correctly indicating the aircraft's bank. It wasn't just the captain who had noticed this issue. The aircraft itself continuously compares each of the ADIs, and it had registered a disparity between the captain's instrument and the other 2 instruments. It put up a flag in front of the captain's ADI, and an owl warning sounded, indicating that there was a disagreement between the instruments. Following the standard operating procedure for this exact situation, the captain handed over control to the first officer, who then began flying the aircraft. As the first officer continued the turn west, the captain began troubleshooting the problem. In an aircraft like the 747, the ADIs receive their information from a system of gyroscopes and accelerometers called INUs, or Inertial Navigation Units. There are 3 INUs on board: INU-1, INU-2, and, as you'd expect, INU-3. Normally, the captain's ADI receives data from INU-1, the first officer's ADI receives data from INU-2, and the standby ADI takes data from INU 3. The captain could see that the standby ADI and the first officer's ADI were matching. It was only his own which was giving a different reading. So their INUs were likely working correctly, while his own was probably faulty. If he wanted to get his ADI working, he would need to feed it data from one of the correctly working INUs. So he switched his instrument to its alternate source using this switch here, the compass stabilization switch. This caused the data to come not from INU 1, which was faulty, but from INU 3. Within 5 seconds of him flicking this switch, the captain's ADI began working properly again, and the warnings went away. As the first officer rolled out onto a westerly heading, the captain took back control and continued climbing the aircraft. After nearly 2 decades of flying and over 15,000 flights, this aircraft wasn't exactly brand new. Problems like this, although serious, were hardly a shock to the crew. What mattered on this departure was that they dealt with the situation in a calm and systematic manner. This was their role in the system after all, to use their training to quickly and safely fix the issues which were bound to emerge when operating a complex machine. Once the plane was in the cruise, with the autopilot on, the captain began testing out the system to see if the issue persisted. He turned the switch back to the normal position. For a while, it appeared to be working, but that was only because the plane wasn't making any turns. As soon as the plane began making heading changes en route, the crew noticed that it was simply frozen at wings level. Interestingly, it had no problem telling how much the nose was pointing up or down, but in turns, it was unreliable. Clearly, it wasn't the ADI itself that was faulty, but the system which was feeding it information, the inertial navigation unit. The captain turned the switch back to the alternate position, and again his instrument began taking data from INU 3. For the remaining 7 hours, the flight progressed as normal across northern Europe, with the switch in the alternate position. At 5 minutes past 3 local time, the 747 touched down at Stansted. The pilots parked up at the gate and shut down the aircraft. It would be too much to say that disaster had been averted. There was no reason that a problem with one of the aircraft's 3 attitude direction indicators should cause an accident. But aviation is a complex system. Every component part is linked to every other part, if not by direct connection, then only by a few degrees of separation. We're about to see exactly how a fault with one of those components can propagate across the others, and eventually stress the system to breaking point. But first, I want to say a quick word about this video's sponsor, Opera. Opera's new web browser is really a breath of fresh air in what has become a pretty stagnant browser space. Unlike a lot of today's browsers, it's quick, feature-packed, and easy to use. One of my favourite features of Opera browser is the Tab Islands feature. I find this really useful because as I browse the web and open loads of tabs, I can just organise them into islands grouped by common themes. So here I've got a tab island for some of the stuff I'm studying as part of my flight training. Here I've got a tab island for food I've been wanting to make, and here I've got a tab island for my work on Green Dot Aviation. I can expand and contract these tabs as I want, which makes it so much easier to stay organised and productive. It's also great to know that with the built-in ad blocker and VPN, I can keep my data safe online with a single click. I also find the sidebar here really useful. It has WhatsApp, Instagram, and Facebook Messenger built in, which makes it easier to stay connected to friends and family. Opera even has its own browser AI, Aria. This is handy because whenever I have a question which Google can't answer, I just ask Aria. Opera really feels like the future of the web. Everything I need is just there in the browser itself. Click my link in the video description to download Opera. It's free, it's fast, and it just works. Now, let's get back to the video. Once the pilots had parked up at the gate, the captain returned the compass stabilization switch from alt to norm. As part of his duties after shutting down the aircraft, the flight engineer recorded the malfunction in the technical logbook, which included a reference code and the phrase, "Captain's ADI, ATT display not reliable, has gyro flag in view, display OK when alternate attitude selected." With that, the flight crew packed up their briefcases and headed towards the door, where the air stairs had now pulled up. They would be resting in London for the day, while another crew who had been staying at a hotel nearby would take the aircraft to its next destination of Milan. On their way out, the crew met a Korean Airlines ground engineer, Kim Il-suk. Despite usually being based in Moscow, Kim had to travel to Stansted because Korean Air didn't have permanent engineering support there. similar situation existed in Milan. This meant that Kim would be staying on board for this next flight. His role at both Stansted and Milan would be to take charge and coordinate with local mechanics to swiftly fix any issues that had arisen during the previous flight. As the outgoing crew was leaving the aircraft, the flight engineer told Kim about the issue with the captain's ADI. He also mentioned that the problem was resolved when the captain switched the attitude and compass stabilization switch to Alt. The flight crew then left for their hotel, with no idea that the first steps had now been made towards disaster. As the new crew for the flight to Milan made their way to the airport, Kim and the local engineer at Stansted began preparing the 747 for its flight. They did an extensive walk around of the aircraft, ensuring that the plane was physically fit to fly, and they also supervised the cargo loading and refueling. Once this was done, they headed to the cockpit to sort out the issue written in the tech log. This is where things started to go wrong for Flight 8509. When Kim opened the tech log and read the entry from the flight engineer, he couldn't tell what the code the flight engineer had written referred to. To find out exactly what it meant, he would need to get hold of an engineering manual known as the FIM, or Fault Isolation Manual. But since there was no permanent Korean maintenance outstation at Stansted, there was no FIM for the aircraft there. Kim's personal copy was still in Moscow. This simple lapse would turn out to be crucial. That's because if Kim had managed to get a hold of the Fault Isolation Manual, he would have seen the procedure which instructed him to either replace INU-1, or if that wasn't possible due to a shortage of spare parts, to switch the captain's compass stabilization switch to Alt, as the captain had done on the previous flight. Instead, as Kim couldn't determine what the code meant, he had nothing to go on but what the flight engineer had written. Kim decided to remove the ADI and check for loose connections, or corrosion. While he got to work doing this, the incoming crew made their way over to the aircraft, and it was an experienced crew. The captain for the incoming flight was Park Duk-kyu. At 57 years old, he had over 13,000 flying hours, more than 8,000 of which were on the Boeing 747. Before joining Korean Air, Captain Park had flown fighter jets for the South Korean Air Force. It was not uncommon for pilots at Korean Air to come from a military background, and Captain Park's career was similar to that of many of his colleagues. As a result of this, military culture was deeply ingrained within Korean Air at all levels. This culture would go on to play a vital role in the outcome of Flight 8509. The first officer was 33-year-old Yoon Ki-sik. Yoon was a new hire with just 1,400 hours in total, only 200 of which were on the 747. This made him vastly less experienced than Captain Park. Before starting on the 747, he had flown the Fokker 100, a much smaller aircraft. The jumbo jet was something of an adjustment, and despite being fully qualified to fly it, he was still very much learning the ropes. Accompanying the two pilots was 38-year-old flight engineer Park Hoon-kyu. Like the captain, he was highly experienced, with over 8,000 total flying hours under his belt, over half of which were on the 747. As the pilots settled in, the ground engineer had determined that a damaged connecting pin was the likely culprit of the captain's malfunctioning ADI. He enlisted the help of an engineer who was qualified to carry out the repair, and together they fixed the pin and reinserted the ADI into the instrument panel. Once this was complete, the first officer then carried out a test of the instrument. Sure enough, when he pressed this test button here, the instrument went through its full range of motion, all the way up and down and to the left and right. All appeared normal. The test also checked whether the comparator warning was working, to determine whether the computers would notice if there was a disparity between the captain's and first officer's instruments. Naturally, the test showed that the comparator was working. But unbeknownst to the crew or the engineers, the test was a total waste of time. There had never been any problem with the ADI, nor with the comparator. The problem was entirely with the INU, which fed the ADI its data. It would turn fully left or right if the INU only told it to. But the INU was broken and incapable of doing that. All the test did was to show that the ADI could rotate freely, which it always could anyway. But without full knowledge of what had originally gone wrong, the crew were now lulled into a false sense of security. As far as they knew, their instrument had been fixed. With that, the pilots made their final preparations for departure. Darkness was gathering, and in a few moments, the crew would be taking off from Stansted. Just before 5:30, The crew had completed their checks, and the plane had been loaded with cargo and fuel. Its takeoff weight would be over £500,000, 68,000 of which was fuel. After a delay, Flight 8509 was finally issued its clearance to Milan. The journey was scheduled to take 2 hours. By now, the crew had missed their original departure slot, and the pushback team originally assigned to their flight was attending to another aircraft. With the clock ticking, the pilots had to wait another 30 minutes before a pushback crew became available. At 6:15, the tow bar was connected, and the massive aircraft began its pushback away from the stand. Finally, the plane was on its way. But just as the crew thought their problems were over, there was a call from the ground crew. They could push the heavy 747 no further. The pushback tug lacked the power needed. Due to the 747 now being between the stand and the taxiway, the crew were unable to taxi to the runway from the current position. As a result, they had to wait for a marshaller to guide the plane. This caused a further delay. It was almost as if fate itself was intervening, trying to prevent the plane from departing. But at 6:25, fate let up. Flight 8509 was cleared to taxi to runway 23 at Stansted. As far as the crew were concerned, the clockwork was running slowly. They had no idea that the problem lurking just beneath the surface was far more serious, and it had nothing to do with the faulty instrument, or the delays, or the weather. After all of the delays and the issues with the pushback tug, Captain Park was growing impatient. In between the first officer's radio transmissions to air traffic control, the captain began to admonish him. In one outburst, dissatisfied with the way Yoon was handling radio calls, Park said, "Make sure you understand what ground control is saying before you speak." In complete contravention of Korean Air's standard operating procedures, Park then began handling the radio work himself while taxiing the aircraft. He had now taken the first officer out of the loop, taking on most of the work in the cockpit himself. This crew was not a team. As if that wasn't enough, during the taxi, when air traffic control called the plane and the first officer didn't respond, the captain gave out to him for failing to answer. Yoon was damned if he did and damned if he didn't. This highly unpleasant working environment, caused directly by Park's attitude towards his inexperienced first officer, was a symptom of the high power distance culture prevalent in South Korean society. In the year 1998, a group of pilots from New Zealand conducted a safety audit report on Korean Air, which revealed significant issues with the airline. The report brought to light a pervasive level of complacency, arrogance, and incompetence throughout all sections of the airline's flight operations. Between 1970 and 1999, Korean Air had 16 aircraft incidents and accidents, which caused nearly 700 casualties. The report suggested that the airline's organisational culture, which is heavily influenced by South Korea's national culture, played a significant role in these incidents. As Flight 8509 taxied out to the runway that evening, the worst elements of this culture were on full display. Captain Park continued to berate his less experienced first officer, who became increasingly resigned and less willing to challenge the captain for his mistakes or for breaking SOPs. It wasn't that the captain was having a bad day. The attitude he displayed was endemic within the airline. But then, another instrument started having problems. As the flight continued its taxi to the runway, Park noticed that his instrument, which showed the plane's distance to radio beacons, was displaying an incorrect value. The display should have read close to 0, because the beacon was at the airport. However, it was displaying a distance of 399 nautical miles. This was another source of frustration for the captain. He needed to use his distance from that beacon to judge where he should take his first turn after takeoff. If his distance measuring equipment wasn't working, how would he know when to turn? The captain was especially concerned about this because there was an active noise monitoring program in operation around Stansted Airport. If he strayed outside of the designated departure routing, his bosses back in Korea would receive a noise complaint, which would not reflect well on him. But there was a simple solution to this problem. According to the pilot's charts, they could use a different beacon to guide their turn. Rather than relying on their distance measuring equipment to start the turn at a certain distance from the beacon, they could begin the turn once they are at a certain direction from it. All they would need to do was to tune their navigation radios to that beacon and turn at the point described on the chart. Perhaps this is something that the first officer would have mentioned in a more positive working environment. But given how things had gone so far, what were the chances that the captain would be receptive to his mentioning this? As the plane approached the runway, the flight engineer provided the first bit of good news for the crew. The instrument finally appeared to be working. But this would be the last bit of good news for Flight 8509. At 6:30, way behind schedule, air traffic control cleared the flight for takeoff. The flight engineer pushed the throttles to the takeoff position, and the 747 began its slow acceleration down the runway. In a few moments, the imperfections in the clockwork would all come together. There was no turning back now. The captain lifted the aircraft into the sky, and it disappeared into the low clouds over the airport. The first officer made the standard call-out as the plane passed 900 feet. But seconds later, the warning system that compares the two pilots' ADIs triggered. This indicated that there was more than a 4-degree difference between the captain's and the first officer's ADI. The problem which the plane had suffered from on the last leg was back. But this time, for some reason, neither the pilots nor the flight engineer responded to the warning. At this point, the captain again said that his distance measuring equipment was not working. He was fixated on this, determined to make the turn at the correct point, which was to be less than a minute after takeoff, 1.5 miles from the beacon. He confirmed with the first officer that the departure procedure required them to turn onto a heading of 158 degrees when they're 1.5 miles from the radio beacon. Again, the comparator warning sounded, this time for 1 second. But still, the crew did not respond to this alert. Their attention was focused entirely on the point at which they needed to begin their turn. Sure that this point had come, the captain now began turning the aircraft to the left. Again, the comparator warning was triggered. This time, after a few seconds, the pilots cancelled the warning. But for some reason, they didn't investigate further. Was the captain's ADI showing a different reading than the first officer's? Given that they were in a turn low to the ground, now would be a good time to check. But the crew were distracted. Their focus was on the departure procedure and on trying to complete the turn successfully. They didn't notice the growing discrepancy between the captain's ADI and the first officer's. As Park rolled the 747 to the left, his ADI indicated that the plane was still flying with its wings level. Naturally, he believed his instrument, something all pilots are trained to do. It's not likely that he had ever encountered an ADI failure in his thousands of hours of flying. As a result, he continued holding his control column further and further to the left, in order to get the stubborn plane to roll. The first officer could see on his instrument that the plane was clearly already turning left, and that this turn was increasing. Even though the captain couldn't see outside, and hadn't yet thought to cross-reference his own instrument against the backup one, there was still a clue that something was off. His ADI might have been providing false information, but his flight director here was still working. As the aircraft headed past the desired track of 158 degrees, the flight director began to demand a bank to the right and a pitch up. Pilots were supposed to follow the flight director. In this case, the fact that it was giving Park instructions which were very different to the ones he expected, which was a turn to the left, should have clued him into the fact that something was amiss. But the captain ignored these cues. The 747 faithfully followed his control inputs and continued to increase its roll to the left. His ADI simply indicated that the plane was wings level. On this flight, it wasn't the captain who first noticed the problem, but the flight engineer. He had been closely monitoring the departure from his seat behind the two pilots, and he had noticed that according to the captain's ADI, the aircraft was not turning in line with his control inputs. He told the captain, "The bank is not accepting." The captain didn't respond. When the aircraft rolled past 30 degrees of bank, the flight engineer made the standard call-out, "Bank, bank." This call was intended to bring the captain's attention to the standby attitude indicator, so that he could see that his own ADI had failed. But Park failed to do so. So hellbent was he on completing the departure procedure correctly, that he had begun to tune out everything else. Crucially, at no point did the young first officer, with a fully functioning ADI, challenge the captain's actions. He didn't respond to the comparator warning or to the flight engineer's warnings. It's possible that with just 195 hours on the 747, he was unaware of the significance of the comparator warnings. But what's more likely is that after being repeatedly berated by the captain for his incompetence earlier on in the flight, he did not wish to antagonize him further. Ironically, it was the captain's lack of faith itself in the first officer's competence, which led to the first officer withdrawing and actually becoming a less effective pilot. Under normal circumstances, the right thing for the first officer to do would be to immediately alert the captain to the aircraft's extreme bank angle, and if that didn't work, he would have to take over control himself. The situation was now rapidly deteriorating. The aircraft was low to the ground, and its turn had gotten so sharp that it was beginning to descend. Park was still holding his control column to the left, long after he should have let go, and still his ADI was indicating wings level. The plane was now banking past 45 degrees, then 50, then 60. As the bank angle approached 80 degrees, the 747's wings were no longer able to maintain lift, and the plane began to descend rapidly. Even now, with the aircraft screaming towards the ground, Park was fixated on ensuring that he had complied with the requirement to commence a turn at 1.5 miles from the radio beacon. He asked the first officer to request a radar vector from air traffic control. But you never got the chance to do this. The plane was now fully on its side, and its nose was pitching more than 30 degrees below the horizon. The sound of the wind rushing by the cockpit as it plunged towards the ground was only interrupted by the flight engineer saying, "Oi, bank!" A split second later, the plane hit the ground. There were no survivors. From takeoff to impact took just 56 seconds. Korean Air's response to this incident was profound. The airline completely modernized its crew resource management training program, which was the first time it had significantly updated it in almost 15 years. Never again would a power imbalance in the cockpit lead to a crash. But they didn't stop there. As well as this, Korean Air began training its pilots more often on unusual attitude scenarios and on instrument failures. If the captain of Flight 8509 had recognized that his ADI had failed, even relatively late into the turn, he would have been able to recover the aircraft. The airline also made changes to how it did its maintenance, relying less on contractors and expanding its engineering bases so that it had permanent staff at nearly all of its destinations. Hundreds of other smaller changes were put into place over the following months and years, completely transforming the culture within the airline. The year 2024 marks the 25th anniversary of the loss of Flight 8509. It is thanks to these changes that in those 25 years, not a single Korean Airlines plane has crashed, causing fatalities. This has been the trend in the industry more generally, which is why aviation continues to be, by far, the safest way to travel.